Our next group is going to focus on, it's a fireside chat, and they're going to be focusing on Congress and the Clarity Act. We've got two amazing people, Janessa Lopez, who is the public policy lead for digital assets, AI, and emerging technology at Block. And we've got Congressman Warren Davidson. He represents Ohio's 8th congressional district. He is a member of the House Financial Services Committee, and he's focused on policies that grow our economy and instill fiscal discipline, something we sorely need. Please welcome them both on stage right now.
Thank you for being here with us today.
It's an honor to join you all. Thanks so much.
And thank you, everybody, for being here as well. Welcome to GW's first ever Bitcoin conference in our nation's capital. This is very exciting.
Yeah, very exciting. Glad for George Washington to host it. And they've hosted a couple forums over in classrooms, but it's really nice to have this kind of an event.
Yeah, it's fantastic. By way of introduction, as mentioned, my name is Janessa Lopez. I lead digital assets policy for Block, which is the parent company of Square and Cash App. And I'm honored to be joined today by Congressman Warren Davidson, who's been a leader in digital assets for many years, I think going back to, 2016 maybe, 2017?
Well, I got elected in 2016, and there wasn't a whole lot going on, but in 2017, you had the initial coin offering market going nuts, and we kept trying to get hearings, but as a junior member, you don't really get to select what hearings, you get a little bit of input, and we could never really get it done. So in 2018, that's when I hosted this meeting at the Library of Congress, and that turned into kind of the first real gathering of people in DC to try to deal with it, and that produced the Token Taxonomy Act, which is really the thing we're still trying to do is how do you apply the Howey test, a court decision, to digital assets, and you should have some kind of bright line test to say this is or isn't a security, and the fact that we haven't done that allowed Gary Gensler and others to just wipe out all kinds of capital and chase it away. So we've needed it for a long time. It did some other things, but that's the most essential thing that Token Taxonomy did. And I thought when I introduced it in 2018, it was bipartisan. It was a pretty basic thing, apply existing court case to set up a law, that we would be able to do it by the summer of 2019. So I missed it by just a little bit.
Just a little bit, yeah. I mean, that's still what we're trying to solve now. But as author of the Token Taxonomy Act, and the Keep Your Coins Act, and now co-sponsor of the Clarity Act, which is what our conversation will revolve around today, you've really been at the forefront of this conversation for a very long time. But I want to do kind of like a level-setting question to start us off. For those in the audience who might not be following this legislation as closely as we do, can you explain the Clarity Act and what problem it's trying to solve? How would it make digital assets regulated differently in the US from how they're currently treated, and why is its passage so important?
Yeah, thank you for that. So the Clarity Act, the name says what the goal is, to provide clarity. And we passed the Genius Act, which regulates stablecoins. Stablecoins are maybe 7% of the market capitalization right now. The other 93% in digital assets would be clarified by the Clarity Act. And so a lot of these things are intentionally securities. People are trying to tokenize things and have them regulated as securities. And some things, like Bitcoin, clearly aren't securities, and we want to make sure that it stays that way. But for new things, you should be able to decide, what is this? Is it a security? Is it a commodity? And then lastly, lots of them are neither. They're just real-world assets. They represent all kinds of things, and you should be clear, how are they regulated? And this bill's designed to be able to provide some level of clarity to that. Now, to get the votes, I think we've added a lot of things to it than where we left off in Token Taxonomy Act.
Yeah.
So it's become more complicated. It creates more government in some ways. But it does answer that most essential question, which is, how should we regulate it? Who should the regulator be? And then you can't just have kind of like the Lawfare where Gary Gensler was, not providing clarity. He was, in fact, creating chaos by enforcement actions and selective enforcement actions.
Right.
And the example I use all the time on that is, he sued the Kardashians for promoting Ethereum Max as an unregistered security. So they settled and paid, I don't know, a couple $1 million settlement for promoting an unregistered security. But Ethereum Max continues to operate with no impact. So there was no coherent strategy to make, whoa, this is an unregistered security, so we should shut it down. So there was no enforcement action against people operating Ethereum Max. So this was by design to basically chase capital out of the space, and it was coordinated with bank regulators and other things. So if you get this clarity that we're trying to provide, then I think the market will be able to take shape. But the component that we're trying to make sure stays in it, and this is in the base text in the Senate version, is the Keep Your Coins Act, which is self-custody. And, well, under current law, you should be able to have custody of your own assets, but we've seen multiple administrations try to take away self-custody, including even in January, Chopra at CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, was trying to limit the ability to have self-custody. Steve Mnuchin, when he was Treasury Secretary for President Trump, tried to limit self-custody. Going all the way back to 2013, FinCEN tried to limit self-custody. And so I think like the most base question when you say, do they support it, Bitcoin or digital assets, crypto, is do you really support self-custody? Because at the end of the day, if all you have is an account-based system, it really doesn't radically change things that much. There's still room for new entrants in the space, but it really doesn't change and empower individuals.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Before we dive into the Keep Your Coins Act, because I have some follow-up questions there, I want to kind of go back to the broader context on clarity, because I think you gave a great overview of why it's important, why we need it. And I think existing law, we're kind of dealing with a fragmented approach. So we have the state MTLs across all 50 states. We have the BIT license and similar, digital asset licenses sporadically throughout the country. But we don't have a federal framework that clarifies the rules of the road of how to operate. So what are some of the risks of not having that clarity in the U.S.?
Well, if you look, when they passed the infrastructure bill in 2021, the Treasury had to clarify that just operating a node doesn't mean that you're a money transmitter and that you have to collect all this information, which isn't even technologically possible. It was, I would like to say, ignorant. People that put it in there know exactly how it works. And they wrote it that way on purpose, but they basically said, we're not going to enforce this is taxable events and everything else in Treasury. So there are all kinds of things that you would have to collect 1050I, which is if you transmit more than $25,000 in cash, you usually have to collect know your customer information. And so Tom Emmer has a bill that makes it clear that unless you have custody of someone else's assets, then you're not a money transmitter. You're not a money service business. And so you don't have to comply with the money service business rules. And we do need federal preemption on that because, multiple states have decided to be anti-crypto and go to war on people that essentially just operate a node. And, staking or proof of work models, they depend on that. So that is how the blocks are moved. And you don't capture all this traditional information because the entire computing architecture is different.
Yeah.
And so it's different by design and is secure by design that way. But it's not truly secret. It's got a level of privacy. And you can follow it on chain. So there are things that kind of big government folks are trying to do to shut it down. And there are things that, whether you like big government or not, they're just using big government to try to protect their competitive advantage and not be disrupted by, fintech.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad you brought that up. The Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, as you mentioned, I think is one of the biggest issues for the industry writ large, and a big focus for us at Block as well, because as you said, it puts so many people at risk of being considered money transmitters or having to have a license to operate. And we've also seen the DOJ take action against software developers and prosecuting them for unlicensed money transmission. So this is a real risk that affects, developers, node operators, as you said, but even self-custody wallet providers who never have custody but could be considered money transmitters. So there's a lot of gray area here, but I think these protections are important, and I hear you're now a co-sponsor of this bill. Is that correct?
Yeah. And look, the big thing, I love that you didn't say the names, Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet, but look, we thought when the Trump administration came in and put out their great executive order, this would be a non-issue. It would be like all the other Gary Gensler Lawfare stuff. It would just go away. But the Southern District of New York in Department of Justice continued to bring the case. And Tornado Cash was treated as if they were laundering money.
Yeah.
And they just have a platform, like they downloaded software. This would be like going after Microsoft because the cartels were using Excel to track their proceeds. Like Microsoft Excel is really bad. These guys are really bad people. They've enabled people to track their money. Like, so this is really crazy that you could bring software developers or neutral platforms and hold them to account as if they're participants in illicit finance, which they're clearly not. So I think it was a terrible case. We need to get that corrected. And frankly, one of the other things with this Lawfare, in some cases, they don't even care if anybody's ever found guilty, is the process of, driving up their legal fees and slowing down wrecking their entire business, wiping out their capital stack is kind of the goal. And if they get somebody to be convicted of something, well, that's just bonus for these people. It's a sick, sick world, and there are people that don't really understand this space, but the people that are waging this lawfare against others, they do understand the space. They're acting not in good faith at all. These are not good people, and so I really find it shocking that the current administration allowed that case to proceed.
Yeah, well, I know that the DOJ, the Attorney General now, has kind of clarified that they wouldn't bring forward charges like this going forward. Is that enough? Like, what happens if this bill does not become law and there's a next Democratic administration that might do what the previous one did?
Yeah, I mean, A, we need a law so that no one can do this because it's wrong. And B, I think that President Trump should weigh in and wipe out this case. I mean, it's a bad verdict, a bad case, shouldn't have been brought. And thanks. That's the only just outcome here. You can't just let these people be found guilty and treated as if they're engaged in illicit finance when they weren't.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge for the industry. So kind of like zooming out, giving some procedural context for the audience here, the BRCA was included in the Clarity Act, which passed the House in July with your support. That now goes to the Senate, but the Senate is considering their own market structure bill. It has some similarities and some differences to the Clarity Act. If that were to be passed in the Senate, they now have to reconcile those two bills before it goes to the president's desk for a signature. That's kind of how it works, right? And the BRCA was also in the Senate version, as was Keep Your Coins Act. Congratulations on that. I'm just curious, there's a lot that has to happen before this potentially gets signed into law by the end of the year. From your personal perspective, what are the chances of this timeline? It's very ambitious. What would it take for this to get across the finish line?
Well, we all know that it's very rare for Congress to miss a deadline. We're about to miss it on a pretty noteworthy thing on funding the government. And I say we, the House, we passed our bill that funds the government, status quo CR, 2 weeks ago. So the Senate's still struggling to get to yes. I say the Senate, really, Democrats aren't yet on board, frankly, with the same bill that they all voted for in May, or in March. So this is not like new funding, new priorities, or anything else. It's the same bill that passed in March. So we're all fighting for different things. Instead of resolving that, we're going to do that on that. So this fight is basically disrupting Senate banking, who was supposed to do a markup on Clarity and vote in committee in the Senate this week. So they set a goal. Senator Tim Scott, who's the chairman of that Senate Banking Committee, said, "I want to vote on this in Senate banking by September 30th."
Yeah, today.
So that's going to slip. But hopefully, it's easy to recover. You got plenty of time before year end and get back on track. And it's the same. Like, I'm super excited about the bill, but the details do matter. Yeah. And so if it goes through as the base text is right now, I love it. There's a few things that would make me love it more. But if you take big chunks out, then it's like, well, okay, I'm not sure that I will support it at the end of the day. Yeah. But I think it's hard to see where, at some level, passing some level of clarity isn't better than the current status quo.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Do you know what the biggest sticking points are for the holdouts? And I don't know if it's all Dems, but I think maybe the AML concerns I hear a lot about. Is that like the biggest issue you hear about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think in general, there's enough reasons for people that want to be opposed to just throw things up there. And there are a lot of people that don't actually understand it. And for a while, like, you know, the Intel community, essentially I've always used like the Patriot Act as a proxy for, you know, whether you like crypto or not. You know, if you love the Patriot Act and think the government should know everything about everyone just to keep us safe, of course, then you probably hate crypto. You know, and it's freedom and freedom and money, like combine the two. Right. You know, you would hate to say, oh, they're anti-freedom, anti-money, and they wouldn't describe that themselves as that either. They're not anti-privacy, they just want to keep you safe, right? So that's why they want to spy on all your bank accounts and have digital ID and central bank digital currency, just to keep us safe. So there's a definitely large faction that likes that, and there are people in both parties, honestly, that like that. So it's one of the issues that really splits us between Republicans and Democrats. But in Congress, it really has become a party line issue on this. And thankfully, we've united Republicans behind crypto broadly, including banning central bank digital currency. We're largely opposed to digital ID. But there are closures, like even the Emmer CBDC ban is a compromise between a more strict ban that I favor, which would turn off you know, what the Fed is calling a wholesale CBDC, FedNow enhanced, kind of a back-end central bank digital currency that isn't targeted to consumers. But to me, like, if you can still do the back end, but the front looks different, it's like Hydra. You have lots of heads in different places, but it all ties together into the same beast on the back end. So I don't really like even the current level of ban that can pass. So I'd love to see an enhancement on that, for example. But if you combine that with digital ID, I think it's a problem. And we can't get the votes. So a lot of this is how much know your customer, how much surveillance goes on. And in an interesting twist where Democrats aren't in lockstep behind the Patriot Act, a lot of them are in lockstep behind digital ID, central bank digital currency, heavy know your customer surveillance requirements with digital assets. And I think it's just something a lot of people don't understand, so they fear some sort of change. And you know, a lot of times people will say, well, we're protecting consumers. I'm like, well, you protected consumers from making, you know, 100 or 1,000x on Bitcoin. I mean, when I first came to Congress in 2016, Bitcoin was trading like $500. You know, and you would think that just in the time since I've been advocating for these changes, just the fact that price movement alone, you would say, you know, maybe this guy's got a point. We should do something different. But that's not the way Congress works.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you said, it's not really necessarily a Republican or Democrat issue. A lot of the principles that Bitcoin are founded on are American principles. It's individual liberty, financial privacy, all these things that you fought for many years. So kind of going back to that on the Keep Your Coins Act, which is really that fundamental right to self-custody, I'm curious, what was the motivation behind introducing this bill all the way back in 2018? And that's way before anyone in DC was really talking about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the Bitcoin white paper, a permissionless peer-to-peer transaction. Now, the hodlers, in a way, is kind of broken the liquidity. You know, they hold on for dear life. There's like, no, we will not part with it. And yeah, I'd feel that way too if I paid for a pizza back. Right. You know, yeah. And you see where the price appreciation's gone. You're like, no, I'm never selling ever. But there's no real liquidity, and there are people that are making it very hard to even have your own custody. So if you look at permissionless peer-to-peer transactions, that is the core of cash. And what we've seen corrupted over time is, you know, before there was a government, you know, individuals have a right to transact. You know, if in a state of nature you and somebody else wanted to trade, you know, I got fruit and you got fish, we could make a trade. It would be a little nosy for our neighbor to come in and say, oh, you guys can't do this. All right? Like, no, like I'm trading, you know, fish for fruit or fruit for fish or whatever, like it's none of your business. Well, now you got government that's like, what you guys doing over there? And they want to look at every transaction, and they want to keep it account-based because they don't trust us with our own money. And to the limited extent that cash isn't entirely illegal, it's truly permissionless. You know, if we trade cash, 20, 100 bucks. You know, most people don't even carry more than that, but in theory you could. Right now the cash transaction number is set at $10,000. If you index that for inflation, it would be like 82,000. So yeah, I'll admit, it would seem a little odd if somebody was like paying for something with $82,000 in cash.
Yeah, a little bit.
You know, a little odd, but it still should be legal. And what you see increasingly is cash isn't accepted anywhere. And so they want to take it to the next level and basically, and look, Christine Lagarde and the European Central Bank has been very clear. She wants there to be no transactions over $1,000. She would prefer there to be none, but for her it's a concession to let anybody transact below $1,000 without European Central Bank surveillance. Yeah. And again, you know, if you assume the best, that's just to keep everybody safe. But the reality is it's a system of control, and they know they can't control you, they control your money. So when we were introducing this in 2020, 2021, Justin Trudeau was canceling the bank accounts for people that were protesting COVID lockdowns in Canada, the trucker protest. And so this got a lot of attention around that time frame. So it's already theoretically possible because in an account-based system, the account operators, banks basically have to spy on you or they don't get to service banks. That's pretty much universal around the world. But the way out of that is cash, or in a digital era, what Bitcoin white paper laid out is permissionless peer-to-peer transactions. And this goes just back to the basic state of nature is human beings have an inherent right to transact. And only with due process and for cause should government be able to get between, you know, private transactions.
Yeah, that's a great point. I also feel like here in the US, we kind of take a lot of this for granted, you know, like we hear about these stories of things happening in other countries, of, you know, bank accounts being frozen or, you know, currency just being completely debased, and Bitcoin is really salvation for these people of being able to control their own money and have a way out. So how do you convince your colleagues, you know, in the US mindset where we're kind of like, that's never going to happen here?
Well, I mean, we went through a period where a lot of the world was fine putting you in a detention facility if you didn't comply with some vaccine, right? You had to show your papers to be served a meal. You had to comply in all kinds of ways just recently. So that's recent memory for most adults, right? So when you look at what's coming, you know, Keir Starmer's just now going public with a very high pressure campaign that if you want to work in the UK, you have to have digital ID. In Vietnam, when they started to implement digital ID, they basically locked people out of their bank accounts, and you could have access to your own money again if you complied and got your digital ID. And until then, your own money, you're locked out of. And you know, the same kinds of things could happen anywhere, including the United States. So I think you have to make that illegal, and I think you also have to make it not just where you can't do it. We don't even go to the point where I would like to go, which is you have criminal penalties for government officials who deprive you of life, liberty, or property, and that's one of the things we're dealing with today.
I think that's amazing. You're definitely leading the charge as always. But I think, yeah, it's helpful to know that somebody like you is fighting so that we're not lulled into this false sense of security that can never happen here. And getting these protections in law and in statute, I think, is the ultimate goal. I also want to touch on one piece of the Token Taxonomy Act that you mentioned, which is, you know, obviously clarifying what digital tokens are not securities, but it also established a de minimis for digital asset payments. This is important for us at Block. I don't know if those of you in the audience know, but we're preparing to launch a product that would allow Square sellers to accept Bitcoin at the point of sale by the end of this year. And so that's a huge unlock. Thank you. And I think thus far, the de minimis conversation has been kind of hypothetical, where it's like, yes, that's the original intent of the white paper to make Bitcoin, you know, a form of payment, peer-to-peer cash system, but it hasn't really been that possible because a lot of merchants can't accept it. So with this new product and kind of the conversation about de minimis rising again on Capitol Hill, What do you think the urgency is there? Are you involved in these conversations? Where do they stand?
Yeah, I mean, from the get-go, this was when we had the meeting back in 2018 at the Library of Congress. The goal was to go, like, if you think of it as a tree, we want to go as high up as we can where everybody agrees on what needs done. And then, okay, individuals start branching out. My interests go this way, your interests go that way, and it diverges. Everyone agreed we need a bright line test for what is and is not a security. And everyone agrees you got to deal with taxes. Now, we would love to get where there's no capital gains tax on any assets in some circles. We don't have the votes anywhere near for that. But we already do have de minimis exceptions for currency. So if you're trading and you go to the UK and you have pounds, and then you go to the European Union and you have euros, and so on, and you travel around, as long as you don't net out more than $600 in gains, then you don't have to pay tax on that.
Right.
So the idea that you could, pay in Bitcoin without a capital gains becomes, possible. But for anybody that's held for a long time, the problem is you start realizing capital gains pretty quick.
Yeah.
And then you basically need software to track those gains, which creates all kinds of compliance problems.
Yeah.
And it makes it hard to do the whole, payment system characteristics of the Bitcoin white paper. So I think we have to deal with that. I think the de minimis exception makes a lot of sense. I would love to go further. And when you look at the logic of payments, I think one of the easiest ways for the United States to accumulate Bitcoin is to make it so that people can just pay their taxes in Bitcoin and forget the gains. But if you owe $10,000 worth of taxes, then you move $10,000 worth of Bitcoin, it's worth $10,000, you don't have to realize the gain. And then the US government would accumulate Bitcoin that way, which would be a smart thing for us to have been doing.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I do agree that it would create a ton of accounting issues. I don't even think the IRS would know what to do with all of these reports that they'd be receiving. And yeah, obviously we don't want people being hit with capital gains tax for buying something as small as a cup of coffee, as we like to say.
Yep.
So yeah, we could use your support there. I know Lummis has a proposal in the Senate. There's a House proposal on de minimis oncoming, and a potential end-of-year reconciliation package that it would be included in. Is that right?
Yeah, so the House moves all kinds of bills as standalone things. The Senate has their own tempo. It's a little slower, and they tend to not move standalone pieces of legislation. Yeah. So you basically look for must-pass legislation to hitch a ride on. And that's part of how you wind up with these giant bills where, the Christmas omnibus, which is sort of Congress's sacred tradition. Yes. It's not a good one. But you tend to look at the omnibus or the defense authorization, things that all of Congress is going to vote on, and then you add these other bills onto it. And in some ways, that minimizes debate. So that's frustrating for members who maybe have a preference on a particular policy issue, but they're not on the committee of jurisdiction. But that's the most likely outcome is what's going to happen. You have a few must-pass pieces of legislation between now and the end of the year, including keeping the government open. And you basically add some of these pieces of legislation to those bigger bills. And the good news is once you get it, that way you don't have to worry about some poison pill coming in and killing it on the floor. Yeah. The bad news is once it's cooked, it's pretty cooked.
Right. Well, one last question. I think we have time for one more. I'm just curious, just kind of on a personal note, like what has drawn you to this space? What initially caught your attention? Especially, I think it was self-custody for you and just kind of the original white paper. But if you could share with us your personal take.
Yeah, so personally, I got interested in Bitcoin back in, so I started a company in tooling. We would manage projects for people that you launched the product. We would get the tooling built, metal stamping dies, plastic injection molds. And a lot of the suppliers for those tools were offshore. So we'd send a wire transfer, and then we're like, why aren't you shipping my product? And they're like, well, we haven't received the payment. And we're like, no, I have the wire here. Your bank has the money. And they're like, well, I don't have the money. Yeah. And then once you build relationships, you realize, well, okay, this person's telling me the truth. And their government's going, why is an American sending you $250,000? And my government's going, why are you sending a Chinese guy or Vietnamese guy $250,000? And every single time you do this, they're looking at it like it's new information or something. And the intermediaries are like, this is great, this will take like a week, we'll pick up the carry trade. And they do that across every kind of transaction in the country, and it adds up to a lot of money. And in the meantime, we're like, no, like you and I just want to do business. Go back to the state of nature, the right to transact. Unless you can prove we're doing something wrong, well, then get out of our business, man. And so there has to be a solution to this. And there was. They're like, okay, Bitcoin. I'm like, all right, you want Bitcoin? We can work something out. And then it's, permissionless peer-to-peer. You know you've got the money. I know you got the money. It's right there on the chain. And therefore, I know my stuff should be shipping.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Congressman Davidson, for your time. We really appreciate it.